doctors are working less and making more money. This is Bill Blatchford with Lesson 3 of the Blatchford in a Box. This is a section that I think you're particularly going to enjoy. At least I'm going to enjoy it. Now, you've been through Section 1. We've talked about vision. We've talked about purpose and goals. Now, we've also talked about assembling this great team, and we've talked about a bonus system for the team. And I think one of the things that we have to do now is talk about the profitability of the practice itself. You see, you can do great clinical dentistry, but you have to be profitable. Now, think about this. If you were going to go to a surgeon, would you want to go to a surgeon who was barely making it, or one that was profitable and could make decisions independent of whether they could pay the rent this month or not? You see, I think the same thing is true in a dental office. I actually have observed over the years that the best clinical dentists are also very profitable. Now, it doesn't always fit that way because there are also some very top clinical dentists who have a hard time with the profit side of it. So years ago when I started my dental practice, asked my accountant how to raise the profit. And he said there are two ways. He said one way would be to increase the income. And of course I asked him how to do that. And he said, well, you're a dentist, you'll have to figure out the details on that. I said, what else can I do? And he said, well, we can lower the expenses. And I said, well, how do I do that? And he said, well, I'm an accountant. You're a dentist, you'll have to work out the details. Well, that's been pretty much the advice that many dentists have received. So today we're going to actually work out some of the details. And one of the things that I have observed is it's very difficult to outrun the overhead. And yet I find many dentists have spent years building a large overhead, a wonderful practice, a big office, lots of new equipment, and they're constantly out trying to run that overhead. So today we're going to take a little different approach to that. It's the approach that I have helped literally hundreds of dentists do, and that's to reduce the overhead first and then grow the practice. You see, otherwise we grow the practice and all we do is it's like putting bigger engines in the race cars, except all the race cars have the bigger engine, so they just go around the track faster and faster, and a few more accidents, but the same people win. So today we're going to take a different approach. Now, let's start with the overhead. If we take the overhead and we look at it, and we list the major categories of overhead, listing the one that's the most expensive first, which is the salaries. Now, when I say most expensive, I don't mean it's costing too much. I just mean that we're spending too much money on it. Now, there's a difference. Expensive means it's way too much money and it's not worth it. But it costs a lot means we're simply spending too much, we could spend less. So take a look at the average. Now, I've prepared a chart for this program, and the average for salary is 30%. Now, these averages come right from the American Dental Association, and it turns out that 30% is average all across the country, and that includes the administrative staff, the clinical assistants, and the hygienist. It also includes all payroll costs, including Social Security, which your employer matches. It includes workman's compensation. It includes medical insurance and pension plans. And 30% is average. Well, we can look at that and say, well, if you're at 30%, your average performance. See, I kind of look at this like miles per gallon. Who wants to be average? So 30% is where the staff is average. Now, the next one, the next largest expense would be laboratory. Now, national average is between 8 and 9%. Now, laboratory expense, in my opinion, is a way to judge how good you are at your communication skills with your patients. You see, if your laboratory is 5 or 6%, what that means is that we're not spending much money on laboratory, which means we're not selling any crown and bridge or cosmetic work. If you're up around 10, it means you're selling something. All right, the next expense would be dental supplies. Now, this would be 5%, is the national average. And then we have rent at 3 to 5, and we have equipment at 3 to 5%. We have office supplies at 1 to 2, and then we have marketing, which is usually 0 in most offices. And then, of course, we have X, which is other, and only I know the value of X, and so that makes the balance come out to 73%. Now, in all seriousness, X is really your miscellaneous expenses. That would be your utilities, your phone bills, your CE courses, casualty insurance, things like that, everything that doesn't fit in one of those other major categories. And the average is 73%. Now, that means that the office has to produce, for $1, there's 73 cents in expenses. In other words, the profit is 27 cents. Now, what comes out of that 27 cents? Well, out of that 27 cents, we have to pay off the debt on the practice. we have to fund the doctor's pension plan, we have to pay the doctor's salary. So there are three major things that come out of that 27 cents. You know, an interesting note, a few years ago, before we had dental insurance, the average overhead was 45%, and we took home 54%. The insurance companies came to us and said, you sign on with us, we'll lower your fees, we'll send you a lot of patients. Well, it's a good thing they did, because now we have to see twice as many patients to make the same net that we did prior to that time. Now, let's assume that you really pay attention to these lessons and you really increase your performance, and now we can lower the overhead. You see, Blatchford offices, even with that bonus plan that we discussed yesterday, tend to run right at that 20% level. Now, I'm referring to a general dental practice doing a general mix of treatment. If you have a highly specialized, highly niche practice doing a lot of cosmetics, maybe a lot of implants or something like that, you might be down in the 10 to 15% for team, because you don't need as many people when you're doing large cases. Now, on the other hand, if you're a pedodontist, you see a lot of patients, it requires a larger team, a larger number of people. Now, let's go down to so now you say, well, wait a minute, how can we drop that? And wait a minute, we thought we liked this program, but remember, individual staff members will actually earn more. Remember back to the section yesterday on the bonus, we actually have offices who have bonus, like for years in a row, every month, year after year after year. I had dinner last week with one of my clients, and her team has bonused 28 consecutive times. We had clients last year that earned, individual team members earned over $100,000. So I'm going to reward you real well if you're absolutely performing. But again, are you average or are you above average? And we all think we're above average, of course, and so let's lower that percentage. All right, let's look at the next one. The next one is lab. Now that's your laboratory bill, and I want to raise the lab bill. You notice I put these two in yellow so you can see them, they're highlighted. The laboratory bill being low indicates low sales per customer, low sales per patient that you see in your practice. And I'd like to see 10 or 12%. Now let's do some math right here before we go any further. Let's say you're doing $1 million, gross receipts. If you drop the staff overhead from 30 to 20, that's $100,000, and that goes right to the bottom line. Now, you team members may say, well, wait a minute, that's not so good for us. Well, it is. You actually have a happy doctor to work with. That's one thing that makes it good for you. Now, let's look at the other number. What if we're doing that $1 million and we're at 8% laboratory? That means an 80% lab bill, $80,000 lab bill. Let's say at $200 per unit, that's 400 units per year. What if you increase that by 50%? What if you increased an extra another 200 units of Crown and Bridge, which would be $200,000 at, say, an average fee of $1,000. Now, the only thing that comes out of that $200,000 would be the lab, the 20% for the staff, and the supplies. In other words, about 65% of that is actual net income, or if you're doing the math with me, that's about $130,000. So we're only to the second item, and we've increased the net by $230,000. Now, you team members in the room may turn around and look at your doctor right now. He's getting a big smile on his face. But remember, we've got a bonus system in place that you're going to do better as well. All right, this math gets real exciting for me. As you see, it's real easy to start looking at this and say, okay, what can we do? How can we make this work better? And we've just looked at two numbers. We've looked at your staff overhead, that is your salaries, etc., and we've looked at your lab percentage. We've looked at those two numbers, and we've already, on this $1 million practice, come up with over $200,000 of increased net. Now this, you may think, well, this is really pie in the sky, but these are the results that we get. I mean, this is real. This happens. And the good news is, you see, by simply increasing the amount of Crown and Bridge, the amount of cosmetics that you do, it increases that dramatically. Now, this is without doing anything else on your overhead. Now, let's take a look at some of the other items. Now, I mentioned when I was going through this, I brought supplies up next, and you'll notice on the graphic they're in a different position. However, this is where most doctors and most offices try to save money on their overhead, as they try to buy the cheapest gloves, let's get less expensive impression materials, etc., and it makes no difference. You see, if you were to shop all of the catalogs and all of the websites for the best deal on dental supplies, if you save 20%, what have you saved? You've saved a whopping 1%. Now you see, that's hardly worth the time. And of course, I tease about the fact that when you do that, you have one extra dental assistant who spends 25% of her time pouring through all of these websites trying to find these, and you may spend $500 or $600 every month before you get the first pair of gloves in the office. They better be pretty nice gloves. But you see, it makes no sense. So my recommendation is go to a full-service supplier and have them keep you at between 5 and 6%. And you become a #1 customer for them. You see, that's so easy, and it saves the same amount of money. So then we go to rent and equipment. Well, as you can see, it's 3 to 5%. It's really not a big deal. Now, it is possible to overbuild, and we see that from time to time. So when you're getting ready to build or getting ready to go into a new office, do a little math. If you're in $1 million practice, you have roughly 5% to spend on a combination of rent and leasehold improvements. Do the math. Don't just build it and hope that they will come. Well, the same thing's true with equipment. You have a budget between 3 and 5%. Stay within that budget. You know, I see doctors from time to time that are 10% of their gross is going to equipment, and they do have every latest whistle and bell gadget, but do you need all of those things? I say, just be prudent on this. Now, let's look at the other expenses that we have. We have office supplies, which would be paper supplies. And of course, that's getting smaller and smaller all the time as we go paperless, etc. But you'll have some small expenses. But the rest of the things aren't worth really mentioning. It's just the miscellaneous expenses. You can't change your rent. You can't change your utilities. You can't change your insurance policies. You see, you really can't save much on these. So focus on the ones that make a difference. Now, I've left marketing to last. I'm going to recommend a 3 to 10% marketing budget. Now, we have a whole section on marketing coming up, so I will not go into that at this time, but you need to budget for it. People say, well, what should I do? And I say, well, what's in your budget? So have a budget, 3 to 10%. And you'll say, well, why 3 or why 10? Well, if you have a pathologic new patient flow, you better go full power. You better go 10%. And again, if you're in a metropolitan area, you might go 10%. But if you're in a small town, you can buy a lot of media for 3%. So that will come up with a total then of somewhere around 50 to 55%. Now that makes a whole lot more sense. You see, this is what I mentioned in the opening remarks to this series, is that do you want $1 million practice at a 75% overhead, which nets $250, or do you want a practice doing $500 or $600 at a 50%? Well, I have a better idea. How about $1 million practice at 50%? You see, we know that we can create these percentages regardless of the size of the gross income. Now, having said that, there is a point. You have a certain amount of fixed overhead that if you produce a low amount, you have to get past that point. I call that the break-even point. And that's something that everyone needs to calculate. What is your break-even point? What does it take to operate this practice on a monthly basis? In other words, how much income do I need before the doctor gets paid? All right, another area to look at in increasing your profitability are your fees. Now, this is just an interesting observation after working with a couple thousand dentists over the years, is that almost every dentist I talk to and every staff that I talk to assures me that your fees are the highest in the area. Well, we do a very informal poll when we come to your office when our consultants come in on our coaching program, and we pick up the phone and we start calling and we just start asking, what are the fees in your area for various procedures? And what we find out is, in most of the time, that your fees are not the highest in the area. Now let's go back to a first session in this series on vision and purpose. Remember we said the 3 questions, who are we, what do we do, and for whom do we do it? And one of the things that we said is we do high quality treatment. And we do it for those people who appreciate the level of quality that we provide. Well, what is the level of quality you provide, and are you charging a fee that's a fair fee for that quality? See, are you charging a high enough fee that you can use the best laboratories? Are you able to use the best materials, or are you cutting corners? Now, as a patient, when I come to you, I don't want to know that you're using an inexpensive laboratory. I'd like to think that you're using the best materials and the best laboratory available. And I'm willing to pay to have that done. So take a look at your fees. And there are several fee surveys that you can do that will actually compare your fees to other fees in the same area. And I say be in the 90th percentile. Because when I talk to doctors, you all say you're at least the 90th percentile, or you're the best operator in town as far as clinical dentistry goes, so let's charge for it. Now let's play with this just for a moment. Let's say that you're doing a large cosmetic case. What would happen if you charged your current fee plus lab? In other words, you just gave yourself an increase. And I'm going to tell you that the extra care that you take when you know you're being fairly compensated will be worth it to the patients. So look at your fees. A $100 increase in fee on a single crown is not a lot of money on a one-on-one basis, but over the year it makes a big difference. Do some math, play with that, see what that will do. So these are several areas you can do to increase profitability, and we've hardly scratched the surface. Now let's take a look at another one. We talked yesterday about why do you, in the task analysis, I mentioned why do you send statements? And of course the answer very often is to get paid. Well, I suggest that we send statements because we failed to ask for the money when the patient was standing there. Now I have looked at accounts receivable for a number of years, and one of the things that our doctors have consistently done is we get out of the accounts receivable business. You see, a little graph that I was exposed to by a banker at one time was showing me what accounts receivable were worth. And if you start out with $100,000 of accounts receivable January 1, and you're still holding $100,000 December 31st, and yet you're collecting 95%, many offices think that is absolutely wonderful. Because see, I ask very often, what is your collection ratio? And they say, oh, we collect 95%. Isn't that great? And I say, well, that's wonderful. But let's take a look at what the real costs are. You see, if we look at the cost of what does it really cost to carry that $100,000 in receivables. And by the way, there have been times where we have been told by various consultants that it's all right to carry a month and a half in receivables any given time. Well, my suggestion is to take a look at the following numbers. So let's take this $100,000. Now, if you had the $100,000 at the first of the year, you could invest that money and you could perhaps earn 10%. So there's $10,000. Now, inflation is also going to take part of this away. Now, inflation goes up and down with the economy, but over the years, I think it's fair to say that we probably lose 5 to 6% on inflation every single year. Now, how does inflation work on your receivables? Well, $100,000 at the first of the year, it still says $100,000 at the end of the year, but at the end of the year, that's really only $95,000, isn't it? You know, when you take the money out to go buy groceries for your family, it only buys 95 cents worth of groceries at the end of the year. So we've lost 10 in inflation, 5 in inflation, 10 in interest, so we're down 15,000 right there. Now let's go to the next one, and this is billing cost. Now, Harvard Business Review has written several articles on this, and they say that for a small business under $5 million, which probably most of you qualify for, it's $12 to $15 per statement per month to carry that active account. Now, many offices look at this and say, well, it's only roughly 50 cents for postage, but it's not the postage. It's the labor of putting those statements together, it's the computer that we use, and it's all of the other things that we do to make this statement get to the patient, and then process the money as it comes in. $12 to $15 an account. Now, if we were to make some suppositions here, one would be that this million-dollar practice is probably carrying somewhere around 300 active accounts. And if you're carrying 300 active accounts, and I'm going to lower the value from the $12 to $15, assuming you're really efficient, and I'm going to say $10 a piece. That's $3,000 a month. And the question is, how many months next year are you going to send statements? Well, of course, the answer is 12. So that's $36,000 in billing cost. Now let's add the 36 to the 15, and we're up around 51,000 so far. But there's another big one coming along that you haven't thought of. You said you had a 95% collection ratio. So what does that cost you? Well, it's not $5,000 out of the 100. No, it's $5,000 out of the $1 million production that you're doing. So that's $50,000. So wow, we start out with $100,000 in receivables, and in this math, we have lost over $100,000 on that. What would be a solution? Well, before you look at the solution, let me ask you one more thing. How much of that would have been net income? And the answer is all of it. Now the next question is, at your current rate of overhead, what would it take to raise $100,000 in net income? Well, if you're at 50%, you do $200,000 worth of dentistry and make the same $100,000 that we made by simply collecting time of service. You see what this cost you? That's $100,000 a year. The next question is, how many years have you practiced? Now, team, look at your doctor. Is his face turning green just a little bit? Could be her face as well. Would it be green? I don't know. But it would be a different color. So anyway, the point is this, that we have lost a lot of money over the years by sending statements. And some of you are going to say, oh golly, our patients wouldn't do that. They're not used to that. And I say just the opposite. I say just the opposite. Your patients are used to paying at time of service. It's the team that's not used to asking for the money at time of service. You see, if you draw on a piece of paper a large circle, and inside that circle you put 4 or 5 small circles, so it looks like eggs in a frying pan. Now on each side of one of those circles, those represent different parts of your patient's life. For example, one could represent their house. Now, in their house or their home, how many business transactions per year? We could probably put 100x, I mean hundreds of transactions. One could represent their car, and how many business transactions there? Well, again, it would be hundreds, wouldn't it? And one could represent travel or hobbies or various parts of our life. And every one of those circles, you see, we have hundreds of transactions. Now, with your pencil in this large circle, someplace just a little obscure corner, I guess there's not a corner in a circle, but put a small dot with a pencil someplace. And that represents dentistry in your patient's life. You see, they come once or twice a year, and they go to all these other places hundreds of times a year. How do they pay there? They pay with check, cash, or credit card. So tell me they're not used to it. You see, some of you grew up at a time when maybe your parents had charge accounts in various business establishments in town, and you could charge things and get a bill once a month and pay it. Well, what happened to all those small businesses? They're all gone, aren't they? You know why they're gone? They made so much money that they sailed off into the sunset and retired. No, most of them went broke. And who do their successors do it? It's check, cash, or credit card at time of service. That's how it's done today. Now, one of the things that we talk about, for example, if you take a look at your accounts receivable, I will assure you that most of those are small amounts. See, most teams will tell me, oh, we collect everything except what the insurance companies owe us. I see. But I've looked in thousands of offices, and what I see are small amounts, under $200, $300. So why don't you create a new policy today that everything under $300, as an example, is check, cash, or credit card. It's just fine. And everything over that, use an outside source. Use an outside funding service like Care Credit. And now the patients can make payments, but you get your money. And so when the patient comes up, and we'll talk about this more in the part on case presentation and sales, but can I make payments? Absolutely. Would that work for you? And you just keep right on going and you set it up like that. But look what we've saved right here. At this point, with only 2 things, and we haven't even calculated your fee increase yet, at this point we've already increased your income, your net income, by over $350,000, and you have not done any more work. Now, I know that none of these systems will work 100%. So what if we took 3/4 of that $350,000 and you still increased your net over $250,000? Now, to me, that is significant. So what did we do? We didn't do any more dentistry. Well, we did. We increased our sales of Crown and Bridge, but we didn't have to see any more patients to do that. We just simply asked, would you like fries with your burger? And sometimes we did 2 teeth instead of 1 tooth. I mean, that's as far as we've gone today. We've lowered the overhead on the team from 30 to 20 while putting the team on a bonus system so they can do better. We've lowered the expenses on collections. We've lowered that. And so this is a pretty good start on increasing your profitability. And the good news is you didn't work anymore. It did not require any more days. So an important point in increasing the profitability of a dental practice is knowing the cost per unit. And as I lecture across the country, I usually ask the question, what does it cost to do a crown? And what I usually hear is what is the fee for a crown? And I say, no, what does it cost to do the crown? And then what I hear is, well, the lab bill is this much. Now, what is the total cost to do that? And this is important, and it's actually relatively easy for you to calculate yourself. And I think it's important that each team member know what the cost per unit is. Now, in order to do that, we're going to have to calculate our overhead per hour. Now, many of you have a rough idea, but I have talked to a lot of doctors and a lot of team members individually that don't have any idea at all. So let's look at it. Now, let's go back to our $1 million practice that we mentioned a moment ago, and let's say that you're taking out $250,000 of net. That would be the typical practice at 75% overhead. Now, we're also going to subtract in that practice, we're going to subtract a lab bill of about 10%. So that's another $100,000. So we've taken $350,000 out of that. See, now we're down to somewhere around $650,000 of expenses. And that's really, it goes back to, again, what we mentioned a moment ago. What is your break-even point? And if you divide that $650,000 into 12, well, you're roughly $50,000 a month is what it costs to operate this practice before the doctor gets any profit at all. That's close. Now, you can do the real math. Now, let's go back to the overhead per hour. So we're at $650,000 for the year, and that includes the doctor's salary has come out, plus the lab bill has come out, and we're still at that $650,000. So now, if you're working roughly, just roughly, 1,500 hours. Now, you can calculate the number of hours you work per year, and you divide that number of hours into this figure that we've just come up with. And in our example, you can see we're somewhere a little over $400 an hour. Now, if we have 2 providers in the office, that is one hygienist and one doctor, that's about $200 each. And some of you are going to say, well, why is the hygiene overhead the same as the doctor's overhead? They can't produce as much. This has nothing to do with the income side. This is the expense side. And if we take 2 patients that come into the office at the same time, and they both use the parking lot, somebody rents that parking lot, they both use the reception room, they both use the administrative staff, they both use a treatment room. So you see, it all comes out. It's the same overhead. Remember, we pulled the lab out earlier. So that's $200 an hour in this example. All right, so let's divide your appointments now into Class 1s, that would be 200 and below. Class 2 would be 201, we'll say 401. And a Class 3 would be 402 and above. Now, these are just arbitrary numbers, but notice I started with the overhead per hour. So, how do you make money in a dental practice? Well, obviously not in Class 1s, because there you break even at best. Class 2s, you make some, and Class 3s, you start to make some money. So how do you increase the profitability? Do more Class 3s. Do less Class 1s. Now, having said that, I would challenge you, and I'd be willing to bet with you, that you probably spend at least 70% of your day in Class 1 appointments. Now, fortunately for us, we make enough in the other 30% of the day to cover that. But I'm going to ask you, which of the 3 types of appointments do you spend most of your energy on? That is, trying to fill which appointments? And in most offices, we spend most of our energy trying to fill Class 1 appointments. I suggest we put equal amount of energy into converting some of those Class 1s into Class 2s and 2s into 3s. How do you do that? We'll cover that in the case presentation part, but basically, would you like fries with your burger? It's so simple. People, in case you don't know, don't really like to come to the dentist, and they're busy. So help them have some work done while they're here. You see, it's very easy to do this. So now that we have our overhead per hour, you know how to do that. How do you use that? Well, let's take a look at your scheduling. You have a goal per day. You now start to engineer that day to create the income that we need to cover our expenses and actually make a profit. You see, the schedule is not just a matter of filling every line in that appointment book or every line in the computer. We're now starting to think, okay, we make this much on this, I make this much here, and we start to think, how can we make this day fit together? See, it all goes together like a puzzle. Now, let's go back to another thing. Now that you have the overhead per hour, let's time some of your procedures. Now, I always suggest that the dental assistant do the timing, Because every doctor I know, of course, talking to a group of doctors, can always do a molar root canal in 20 minutes. Yes, he does that routinely. Well, wait a minute. Why do you schedule an hour then? Why do you schedule 2-hour appointments for it? So I have the dental assistant time it. Knowing we're spending $200 an hour, you see there's a little incentive here to perhaps become a little more efficient in the clinical area of the practice. An interesting comment that we had from one of our consultants one time, that she was doing this without I didn't even know about it. She was timing dental offices she would go to for in-office consultation. And we found the burr started to turn on the average at 35 minutes after the hour. So in other words, everybody was there at 8 o'clock, patients there at 8 o'clock, but the work didn't start till 35 minutes after. Well, $200 an hour we just wasted. If we have 2 people providing treatment, that's $200 we wasted this morning. So you start to think, how can we make this work more efficiently? Well, we're talking about profitability. Let's talk a moment about doctors' compensation. And I think one of the things that occurs in many offices is a lot of financial pressure put on the practice, and that's because the doctor does not take out a set salary. In other words, we have a big month, we take out a lot of money. That's a huge mistake. Because, really the difference between a large month in a dental practice and an average month might be 1 or 2 patients saying yes to a large treatment plan. Doesn't mean we're starting a trend here. It just means we had a great month. And so the doctor takes out more money. So our suggestion is you set a salary and you always take out the same amount. And I would go conservative on that, so we always have money left at the end of the year. And if you want a bonus at the end of the year, then you can do that. But take a set salary. In other words, don't just keep this flip-flop back and forth. Because I notice in practices we go from high production months or high income months, then we may have a low income month. Even it out a little bit. All right, another principle to think about in profitability is the 80-20 rule. Now, the 80-20 rule is actually called the Pareto principle. Pareto was an Italian economist, and he observed that in his garden, in his backyard, that he got 80% of his peas came from 20% of the seed. So being an economist, he looked around to see what else this affected. And what he discovered was it affected almost everything in business. As a matter of fact, he discovered that in his clients, he had 20% of them owned 80% of the wealth of all the clients. Well, you look at any business and you take a business course, Business 101, and you study this in the first week. So let's apply it to a dental practice. What does this mean? Well, you get 80% of your income from probably 20% of your patients. Interesting thing that these 20% are the ones that we really want to take care of. And I'm going to cover more of this when we talk about marketing in a later series, but think about this. You spend probably 80% of your time on the bottom 20%. And those are the ones you actually lose money on. Now you're going to say, well, how do we tell? Well, let's take a look. Let's take people who miss their appointments from time to time. Knowing your overhead is $200 an hour. If Bill Blatchford is your patient, and Bill Blatchford has a hygiene visit, and doesn't show up, doesn't call to cancel, the visit sits empty, doesn't it? What did it cost for Bill Blatchford's cancellation today? It cost $200. Now, if we're talking a hygiene visit, for example, and if you're charging $200, in other words, you're about breaking even, and your fee may be less than $200, so really my next visit costs $400, doesn't it? You're losing money. So the next time I come, you lose $200. But let's say that Bill Blatchford does this, not just once, but Bill Blatchford does this from time to time. As a matter of fact, he's one of those patients that when you see his name on the schedule in your morning meeting, you say, we probably ought to double book him because he doesn't show very often. Well, why do we keep calling him then? See, we know he's in the bottom 20%. He's costing us money. So let him go. Don't spend any more time calling his next of kin. Don't call his last 3 employers trying to track him down and make that one more visit. And this time I know we're going to convert Bill into a great patient. It's not going to happen. So pay attention to the 80-20 rule and eliminate some of these people from your practice that you don't make any money on. Now, I would say to the doctor, do the same thing with your procedures. When I was practicing dentistry, my staff decided I should not do root canals for the same reason. It was costing us money. And since they were on a bonus plan, it was costing everybody money. And the truth is, the patients were better served going to a specialist in that case anyway. So take a look at your procedures. What are you making money on? What are you losing money on? Now, some of you doctors have hobbies, and I understand. A hobby is something you do, you know you're not making money on it, but you like doing that particular treatment. You know, take up flying, take up fly fishing, do something, but don't do dentistry just because it's fun and you're not making money on it. I think in concluding this section on profitability, the main takeaway from this is net income is a choice. Overhead is a choice. See, I've had clients that have consistently overheads under 50%, and I have clients consistently come in at 75%. See, it's always a choice. Which do you choose, 50% or 75%?